Hello, good evening. Amanda Lemer, your town engineer. We're here tonight for our second public meeting to further along our project and wrap it up within the next month or so. And that is for our vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan for town infrastructure, whether it be our beaches, properties, and we've gone through and have drafted up some conceptual designs tonight. And it is part of a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant. And Brittany with Woods Hole Group is going to go into more detail. We'll have our presentation, and then we'll kind of shift into a workshop. And for those that are remote, feel free to raise your hand if you would like to speak at any point. And again, the workshop part of it won't be available on the hybrid, so it'll just be folks here. So if there's anything that you'd like to share with us, feel free to use that function. And I'll turn it over to Brittany.
Thanks, everyone, and good evening. I'm here to share the results of the collaboration that me and my team and the town have been working on. And it's the Yarmouth, as Amanda said, the Yarmouth Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment Adaptation Plan. Again, my name is Brittany Hofnagel, Climate Resiliency Specialist with Woods Hole Group. Just wanted to go over a quick agenda. We're going to focus on a quick introduction. I'm going to walk us through the process that we used to complete this project. There's 3 phases, and we'll walk through those. We'll talk about some of the adaptation strategies that we developed, and then we'll quickly discuss the next steps after this presentation. And again, as Amanda said, the presentation will be hybrid, and there'll be room for questions and some feedback at the end of the presentation, and then we'll stop the recording to have those here in person interact with some of the workstations around the room. So I just wanted to, those in the room, just wanted to ask a few questions. Raise your hand if you in the room have experienced flooding on your street. Okay. Raise your hand if you've experienced flooding in your neighborhood. Raise your hand if you experienced flooding around town, if you personally have come across flooding that has maybe restricted your access around town. Okay. All right, so we're all been impacted at some level from flooding events and the complications that flooding along the landscape can impact us by. And so that's some of the things that we're going to talk about today is the climate change impacts and the risks of sea level rise and storm surge there is on the town of Yarmouth. First, I want to get to you, share with you how we got to this point. As Amanda said, this is an MVP-funded project. So back in June of 2019, the town of Yarmouth and municipal staff came together to complete their MVP workshop, the Municipality Vulnerability Preparedness Program workshop, which brought a bunch of stakeholders together, analyzed and assessed the potential hazards that the town experiences, and then developed ideas of ways to assess and make the town more resilient to climate change. One of those projects listed in that document was the Infrastructure Vulnerability Assessment and Repair Project. And so that's what led up to this project. So because this project was identified in the MVP program, we were able to help the town go through future funding to actually fund this project. And that we were awarded that, the town was awarded that project this past year. And so you'll see that this is the launch, this year was the launch of that project. I do want to reiterate that this was a collaborative project. So it wasn't just Woods Hole Group steering this project. We worked with all the town departments, whether it was Department of Public Works, the Water Department, Fire, DNR, Department of Natural Resources, the Visitor Center, and other departments. And so this was really a collaborative project to come together and assess municipal infrastructure. So next I'm going to go over the approach to this project. I'm going to quickly go through this section since this was mostly covered in the first presentation that we had about a month ago. We generally call this the vulnerability risk assessment framework, and it's broken up into 3 phases. Phase 1 is we really get to examine and understand the climate change data, and particularly for this project will be sea level rise and storm surge, as those conditions are expected to increase not only in intensity but frequency in the future. We also gathered a variety of asset data. So we worked with the GIS department and town staff to inventory all of the municipal structures and assets that the town owns and manages. Then we conducted a suite of site visits to kind of look at those assets in person. So let's start with the climate change data. We are using what is now considered the state standard in climate change planning for Massachusetts, and it specializes in sea level rise and storm surge, coastal storm surge. It's called the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. It was developed for the state and is the most comprehensive and sophisticated statewide model available for anticipating how climate change, specifically sea level rise and coastal storm events, will influence future coastal flood risks in Massachusetts coastal communities. So the outcome of this model that was developed by Woods Hole Group is what we are considering, these graphics are the annual exceedance probabilities, and that essentially characterizes the annual chance of flooding from a coastal storm at any geographic landscape location during a given year. For example, if you're located somewhere in this dark blue area, your annual exceedance of probability of flooding is 100%. So at least once per year, you might expect to get flooding if you're located in that dark blue. If you are located in this purple here, along Run Pond, Crowell Pond, and Bass River Beach area, you're expected to have a 10% chance every year to become flooded. One thing to notice also in this map is this pink extent. The pink is the 0.1% extent, which we all commonly refer to as the 1,000-year storm. So once every 1,000-year storm, 1,000 years, we might experience that type of storm that will flood the extent of those inland areas. So there are results for 2030, 2050, and 2070. And so when we were considering what we were going to assess in this project, we wanted to make sure that we captured municipal assets that fell in the extent of the worst case scenario. So the extent of the 2070.1%, again, that pink color, is the furthest inland extent that flooding is projected to occur, which is what we use to determine the critical facilities and town-owned infrastructure that would be assessed in this project. Once we understood how we were assessing infrastructure, we then gathered that asset data. We collected information on buildings, generators, roadways, important storage and outbuildings, bathhouses, pump stations, and other assets that, if failed during a storm, would cause a disruption of town service. And that was the importance here, is we really wanted to concentrate our efforts on assessing infrastructure that not only owned and managed by the town, but provided those town services that are important to the people that live here. So based on the available GIS data and the use of that 2070.1% extent, this map shows the location and variety of assets that we analyzed during the project. And after this inventory, overall, we assessed 173 assets. The next phase of this project is phase 2. And this is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of understanding the true vulnerabilities and risks to those infrastructure assets. The first step is the inundation mapping. So all of the asset that we inventoried, we had to use those graphics, those maps with the pretty color to assign the annual exceedance probability to each of those infrastructure assets. And that's what we call the probability of inundation for each asset. And so for 2030, 2050, and 2070, you can see how the probability of inundation for each of those assets change over time. So let's take this parking lot in 2030, has overall a 10% chance. By 2050, that chance of flooding every given year increases to 20%, and by 2070, it's projected to increase to about 100%, which is roughly every year. Once we understood the inundation mapping for each of the assets, we then go through a constant scoring or criticality framework. And so this is really important. This is the part where it was really important for town staff to have their buy-in. The criticality or consequence scoring framework is a tool for important discussion and consensus building and decision making. Each asset is evaluated using several key categories and different scales, which ultimately influence the priority assigned to investments of time and money. And so working with staff one-on-one, we took all of the asset inventory and all the individual assets and scored them based on this matrix. So we considered categories like area of service loss. So does it impact just the building, or does it impact services to the entire town? Also considered duration of service loss, cost of damage, and impact to public safety and health, and how it could affect the economic activity of the town. This table expresses the variety of scores that each of the Yarmouth assets received. The scores of every asset that we assessed for this project will be included in the final report. So this table is just showing a sub-selection, but notice how the scores for those individual categories can vary across each of those assets. If the town makes upgrades and or the function of these assets change over time, these scores can always be updated and adjusted as needed. The next step is then calculating the final risk. So the final risk of sea level rise and storm surge to each of these assets. And so visually, again, we can take that annual exceedance probability for each of those assets, multiply it by that consequence score that we just discussed, and that value equals the total risk. And so that we can develop a final listing of all assets and rank them in how vulnerable they are based on this simple graphic. So this is an example of Bass River Beach. And so you can see how the math works out, taking the annual exceedance probability, multiplying it by the consequence score, and then calculating the total risk. That then takes us to phase 3. Once we have that listing or that table of all of the total risk scores, we can then prioritize those high-risk assets, which then help us inform our adaptation and resiliency plans. So the results of our work here, when you do rank them, starting in the 2030 time horizon, you can have a result of what's most priority. By no surprise, in the town of Yarmouth, the most vulnerable assets that we have identified are part of the docks, piers, and boardwalks that we often find along our coastline, and which includes Packet Landing Marina, Wilbur Park Boat Dock, Grays Beach Boat Dock, and the piers and boardwalks. And we should not be surprised by that. They're all located along the coastline and are dependent on water for their use. If we do take those out of the ranking and focus on just buildings, the top 5 buildings that are vulnerable is Englewood Beach and the Yarmouth Sailing Center, Taylor Bray Farm and the buildings associated with that property, Bass River Beach and the bathhouse, and then the other beach buildings and bathhouses. I will say that the key takeaways to remember here, as I said, is the highest risk assets include the water dependent and coastal infrastructure. But I think the good news here, in the near term, most of those municipal buildings that provide those town services that we all depend on are really relatively safe. The town could pursue some flexible long-term resiliency strategies if desired. As I said again, the full ranking order of assets, those 173 assets that I mentioned, will be included in the final report. This ranked list can then serve as a living document for town staff to periodically review in order to identify if and when assets should be further investigated and acted upon. For example, many of the municipal buildings like DPW and water department facilities are not vulnerable until 2070 or beyond. So town staff over the next few decades can reassess all of their asset vulnerabilities based on the changing future and recorded climate changes that actually do occur. So now that we have these prioritized high-risk assets, we can then start to develop adaptation strategies. I'm going to take some time to really start focusing on some definitions before we get into what we developed for the town of Yarmouth. And I'm going to start with these categories. So here you'll see a graphic that shows some natural mitigations, engineered defenses, adapted structures, and prepared communities. And I will start with saying more nature-based options and natural mitigations or engineered defenses are example of more of those landscape scale strategies that if you place something or install something or implement something along the coastline, the goal or hope of those efforts will hopefully prevent flooding from more inland areas. However, you can also consider adapted structures, which really focus on site-specific adaptation strategies, and those are really just geared to preventing flooding of structures. And then a broader topic is these prepared communities, which provides education and outreach, recommendations for policy changes, and identification of financial funding sources to help fund changes and resiliency efforts across the town. Want to get into some more definitions. When we do think about adaptation strategies and develop concepts, we like to think about them in 4 different themes. Protect. This means we're allowing assets to continue to occupy the same space and use nature-based or hard engineering structures to keep floodwaters out. The next theme is accommodate. This strategy would include modifying assets to enhance their tolerance and resistance to coastal hazards, such as raising structures and making building level improvements or raising low-lying roads. The other 2 topics that I'm not going to go into too much detail tonight are avoid and managed retreat. Avoid is really to keep new development away from areas of current and future risk. This option can be somewhat difficult in a community that is very densely populated, and so that can pose a challenge for communities. And managed retreat is not always a most favorable option. We all love enjoying our time along the coast, but managed retreat is really focused on moving existing at-risk assets to higher ground to reduce exposure to flooding. I do want to go through a couple examples. So, example of a landscape scale adaptation that's meant to protect more inland areas. We could consider nature-based and or hard engineering strategies to reduce flooding in inland areas. And so I provided a few graphics here to make this point. You could use earthen berms, which is in this example down here. You could utilize an earthen berm to elevate the coastal land here to protect a low-lying roadway or other assets behind it. You could also enhance natural dune and beach systems to provide protection of assets and establishing native habitat. Another example of more hard engineering strategies are using flood walls or bulkheads. And again, these strategies are really aimed at protecting current existing infrastructure. The next example is a building-specific adaptation, and this is really aimed at accommodation. So this is trying to keep the infrastructure, the building, or the asset in the place that it's found, but providing some protection, or providing a way to prevent floodwaters from getting in. So you're accommodating the asset by preventing floodwaters from entering the area. So this technique allows for the asset or building to remain its own location, but still prevent flood inundation. And we would consider exploring the use of deployable barriers as an example of this option. So with those examples, I'm going to now talk about specific adaptations that we are likely to recommend in the adaptation plan within the final report. Want to reiterate that the recommendations that I will explain in this section are still preliminary, but hope that these ideas and options that I provide will be indicating of some of the opportunities the town has to increase town-wide resiliency. More detail and solidification of these options will be documented in the final report. So the first example is I'm using the Sailing Center as an example. This is a facility that's along Englewood Beach and serves some recreational purposes in the summer and is extremely vulnerable in the town to sea level rise and climate change. And so we were to make some general building recommendations, and those recommendations include elevating the building if possible. So there's examples of raising buildings on pilings in order to remove that first floor elevation out of the area of possible flood inundation. So many houses, many buildings can be elevated on pilings with added flow-through structures to accommodate and maintain the location of those buildings. We could also, if a building has a basement, we could also consider elevating interior first floor and filling in the basement. So basically backfilling the basement, and that would remove the ability for water to enter that space. We could also employ dry floodproofing techniques. This would include flood barrier panels, use of wet floodproofing techniques. Example would be water-resistant materials in your basement that make it easier to clean up if it does get flooded, or the use of flood vents to reduce that hydrostatic pressure that could build up against basement wall structures. Normal, easy adaptation strategy is elevating mechanical and electric utilities above design flood elevations. So if you have utilities or important equipment in basements, you could elevate those assets to another floor in that building to remove their risk to flooding. And also in the case of the Sailing Center, could deploy some barriers as well to prevent flooding. So again, these techniques could also be used for other municipal buildings beyond the Sailing Center, even for those not vulnerable until 2070. So again, the town can, 2050 comes along, 2070 comes along, sometime in the future they can reassess how vulnerable their infrastructure are and decide to use some of these strategies to protect their buildings. We also provided recommendations on some other asset groups. So again, we focused on piers, docks, and boardwalks. I think an easy option here, especially along our docks and piling systems, is increase the height of those pilings or reconfigure them so that you can increase the height through time. And so Packet Landing is a great example of this. I can't remember how long ago, but they had the instinctual knowledge to raise the elevation of those pilings. So they have really short ones along the dock system, and then they installed higher pilings to prevent those docks from going over the shorter pilings. So that's a great option. We also recommend to possibly relocate waterfront utilities to higher ground. If you have electrical boxes or other utilities, you can move them further inland. And elevate mechanicals. A lot of the boat docks have winches and pump out stations, so finding a way to elevate those mechanisms or find them safer locations more inland. For beaches and coastal buildings, again, a lot of these are along the coastline. But there are ways that you can increase their resiliency to flooding. Some of those include reconfiguring the existing beach layouts. Are you able to shift the layout of a beach in order to accommodate adaptation strategies, whether it's beach dune enhancement or moving the beach house further inland, and things like that. We could also rethink parking configuration and or develop shuttling services. So do we need all of the parking spaces at all of our beaches? I'm not saying you don't. Just reconsider or think about options for reconfiguring parking lots so that you can either maintain access or maintain the use of those locations. There's options for developing shuttling services. I know some of our communities across Cape Cod are considering changing, reducing number of parking spots and offering some shuttling service from more inland parking lots to the beach locations. As I mentioned, we could always explore nature-based options to provide increased resiliency. An example of this would be those dune beach enhancement projects to really bolster that shoreline protection and maintain and provide some natural habitat. And along the actual bathhouses on each of these locations, considering the wet, dry flood proofing of those bathhouses. Another thing we considered, another option was changes to existing policy and reviewing of the regulatory recommendations. At the local level, municipalities can reduce the impacts of coastal hazards through land use policies and development regulations. And this idea is it can ensure that development can withstand present-day coastal hazards, but also the hazards expected during the useful lifetime of the infrastructure. And we can also help this by reviewing existing zoning bylaws, building codes, local wetlands bylaw, and other policy frameworks. I do want to draw your attention to one piece that has been, that has been completed as recently. Cape Cod Commission did release back in 2021 their Cape Cod Commission Model Coastal Resilience Bylaw. And so those working with Woods Hole Group, the Cape Cod Commission was providing a way for communities to integrate some new information into existing wetland bylaws. So those are some other strategies that we're recommending in the final report. We also wanted to highlight some natural resource recommendations. I know I've sprinkled these throughout the options I've already mentioned, but one of the first things the town could do is address undersized culverts, especially those that are associated with tidal creeks, salt marsh systems, and even defunct cranberry bogs to kind of restore those to their natural habitat. We know that wetlands are really important for absorbing of tidal flow and act like a big sponge and buffer during storm events. We could also find opportunities to enhance existing natural resources. So are there isolated areas where we could help promote salt marsh regrowth and replenish or re-nourish some of our beach dune systems? And we know that the town has a really good working relationship with the Friends of Bass River, and so one of our recommendations will likely be to continue fostering that relationship so that we can have mutual co-benefits for natural resources. And one thing I don't want to spend too much time on, but we also wanted to highlight some of our work in potential salt marsh migration. As we know, as sea level rise increases, salt marshes can drown, and if they aren't able to gain sediment as quickly as the sea level rises, we are at risk of losing our salt marshes. So we do have some data that will be further explained in more detail in the report, but we were able to investigate some of how the salt marshes are changing over time and trying to identify areas where we want to prioritize protection. And in essence, we want to allow for salt marsh migration where possible. And so just quick graphics to show how wetlands will be changing over time. So present day to 2070, and you can see there's a lot of this light green color is this irregularly flooded marsh. That's what we consider more of a high marsh. ones that might get flooded once a day or every other day. And then by 2070, a lot of that converts to this regularly flooded marsh, to now more low marsh that's getting flooded every high tide. So using how marshes migrate through time, we can try to isolate areas that the town could pursue for protection. Whether it's vacant land that's undevelopable, we want to make sure that there's policies in place to maintain those protections. But if there is vacant land that's considered developable, we want to make sure that the town has resources to put policy in place to protect those parcels so that we can support marsh migration through time. The last, and here's just an idea of some of those locations that we're starting to look at. And we're working with Brittany from Conservation to further investigate those areas. So I just want to bring our attention to some of the town-wide projects that the town could continue working on to further increase resiliency efforts. Really, the town could review and update the hazard mitigation plan and incorporate the most up-to-date climate projections as necessary. Every town, if they choose, can periodically update their hazard mitigation planning, and that might be a great opportunity to incorporate these recommendations and further assess up-to-date climate projections. We recommend to consider completing neighborhood-specific vulnerability assessments, inclusive of residents and business community stakeholders. A challenge for these state-funded projects is that the town is using funds as a match, and so these are considered town projects, and so it's sometimes challenging to engage and include residents and other stakeholders. And so there is a possibility to do some more smaller scale assessments where we can strategically engage those stakeholders. We also recommend to utilize the results of the Cape Cod Commission's low-lying roadway project to investigate emergency egress planning for most vulnerable roadways. Cape Cod Commission is on year 2 of a Cape-wide project where they're using the same framework that I described in this project to assess all of the low-lying roads across the Cape. And those results are coming out, and the towns are encouraged to utilize those results to move forward in future adaptation planning. Some other examples that I want to mention is the town could revisit existing emergency evacuation and management plans to incorporate potential climate change related impacts. We could also recommend continuing to develop those outreach and education and engagement opportunities to communicate impacts of sea level rise and storm surge and possible solutions and strategies to the broader Yarmouth community. So those are the recommendations that, just a few of the recommendations that will be available or may be available in the final report. The next phase of this project, or the next stage of this presentation, I want to go through some of the conceptual designs that we've developed. As part of this process, the town staff came together to identify the top 3 priority sites and or assets that we would want to focus adaptation strategies for. And those are what these will show. For this project, the top 3 sites that we're developing concepts for are Packet Landing Marina, Englewood Beach and the Sailing Center, and Bass River Beach and the Bathhouse. I am going to focus on just one of these, but the conceptual designs for all 3 of these locations will be available in the final report and are here printed in person in the room. I am going to focus on the Bass River Beach and Bathhouse. This shows an aerial photo of the layout of that existing bathhouse and beach. So we have this big parking lot that covers a connection culvert through Bass River through Crowell Pond. There's a bathhouse in the middle with a boardwalk, coastal resource resources, whether it's dune and beach, fishing dock, pier, boat launch, and but most importantly, we have the bathhouse here and some of these natural resources. This site ranked pretty high in the vulnerability assessment, not only for storm surge, but also sunny day flooding, or what tidal flooding. So these maps show the 100% storm event. So that's the storm that you might expect once a year in, present day and 2070. And so you can see in present day, we have a little bit of storm surge along the beach, but by 2070, you can start to see that at least once a year, we're going to get flooding throughout the area. The two graphics on the bottom are showing flooding from mean high water, or the daily high tide. It's less severe than the storm surge, but by 2070, you start to see daily tidal flooding encroaching on the parking lot. So in order to create those adaptation strategies or concepts for this area, we have to document the existing conditions, which I've already mentioned. We have the parking lots, we have some natural resources, and the bathhouse structure. And so we're providing two options here. First is really just focusing on that site-specific option. So the use of deployable barriers around the bathhouse, and that adaptation is aimed at protecting the bathhouse from that 2050 1% storm event. So that one storm that might come 1 in 100 years. The next concept is more of a landscape option. So this is identifying areas where we can enhance the existing dune in conjunction with adding or using walls and deployable barriers to provide the protection of the landscape and the broader area at Bass River Beach. And also using a tide gate to prevent water from going through the culvert during storms. So we would suggest increasing the size of the existing culverts by at least 36 inches to 36 inches. Again, as I said, the concepts for the other two priority sites will be available during the in-person workshop. And I just wanted to quickly go over where we are in this project. So we've been working on this project since last September, October, and we are in the final stretch. And so everything that I've spoken to about tonight will make its way into the final report, and that will accumulate to the end of the project deadline by Friday on June 30th. And we could have a rough draft and submit a final report in early July. So the next steps is, again, as I mentioned, is completing that final report. We will be doing a Board of Selectmen meeting on the 18th, on July 18th. It'll be a short overview of this information. And we're also hoping to engage the Chamber of Commerce one last time to present the results of this work and have an open discussion. And at this time, before we stop the online recording, I can open the room up for questions or feedback. And if you don't feel comfortable asking questions virtually or in person, you can always email Amanda or I. And if you're here in person, there are some note cards up front that you can submit some questions. But if anyone has questions, I'm free to answer. Yes.
Thank you for undertaking this project with Amanda and her team and all of our departments in Yarmouth. Oh, I just wanted to say thank you to Woods Hole Group and Amanda, the town of Yarmouth, for looking ahead to what we need to protect ourselves. And you've done a fantastic job of calculating the risk values. So please stay engaged with us.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's really important that we stay engaged with the community and share the information that the town is working on. So thanks for those comments. All right, well, if we don't have any questions anymore, that will end the recording for tonight's presentation. What we have left in the room for those here in person are a few stations around the room that will share some of the information and the data that we use to assess the infrastructure. We have some of the maps up front here that show the results of the SLAM modeling, that shows how the wetlands have changed, are projected to change through time. And then back here in the right here in corner here is we can review and you can provide comments and feedback on some of these adaptation concepts. So we'll be walking around. We don't have a timeline. You can stay here till 7:30 if you would like, but we'll be here for the foreseeable future to answer any questions regarding the stations in the room. So with that, I want to say thank you.